I am Oliver, a psychologist, and guilt is the price we willingly pay for doing what we would have done anyway. Today, we dive into the second video about Sukuna's vessel and one of the most complex characters in the entire Jujutsu Kaisen anime. Let's get started. Being responsible is an admirable quality, but feeling responsible for everything can have the opposite effect. The main character of Jujutsu Kaisen exemplifies this perfectly. Itadori carries a heavy burden of guilt and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for nearly everyone and everything. For him, it seems there is no clear distinction between what truly matters and what doesn't. Think of it this way. Your mind is not the same as you. You are the person. Your mind is merely a verbal tool, not your master. But often, it behaves like a noisy servant that can be challenging to manage. It's crucial to remember that we don't need to listen to it all the time. Itadori has a tendency to conceal important parts of himself, as though he fears burdening others. Last week, we discussed a character nearly devoid of empathy. Today, we examine one who possesses an abundance of it. These two traits coexist within the same body, a tragic irony in itself. This dynamic, Itadori's overbearing empathy and Sukuna's manipulation, inflicts immense suffering on the character. When it comes to portraying suffering, Akutami doesn't hold back. Itadori's desire to choose his own way of dying and ensure that others can have a dignified death is deeply tied to the last words of his grandfather. Those fateful words shaped Itadori's behavior, likely amplifying an already present tendency towards self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is what we call a schema. A schema is a long-standing, negative pattern that begins in childhood, persists over time, and shapes how we view the world. Most of us accept these beliefs without question and may not even realize they exist. Schemas are self-reinforcing and resistant to change. Itadori might exhibit what psychologists refer to as a self-sacrifice schema. Like all schemas, this one likely formed during childhood, when a child learns the unspoken rules of family dynamics. Rooted in emotion, these schemas can follow us into adulthood. A self-sacrifice schema often arises when a child faces excessive responsibility at an early age. For instance, they may have had to care for an adult, such as a parent dealing with physical or mental challenges, anything from severe illness to depression. The child's logic behind such a schema is both touching and tragic. If I take care of my parents, they'll get better and be able to take care of me. This is an enormous burden for any child, as they might internalize the belief, if I don't care for them, they won't be okay, and it'll be my fault. Itadori's worldview revolves around this self-sacrifice, which manifests in a dangerous and unsustainable pattern. He deeply cares for others, as seen when he remarked that rejecting the task of retrieving Sukuna's fingers would make him feel just as guilty. He knew he couldn't convince himself it wasn't his responsibility, and that guilt would weigh heavily on him. Studies reveal that action, rather than inaction, often causes short-term regrets. For instance, we might regret saying something embarrassing or agreeing to a tedious task. However, these regrets tend to fade quickly. Researcher Thomas Gilovich found that the things we're most likely to regret are those we didn't do. Regrets from inaction, like not taking that trip, not asking someone out, or not pursuing a degree, linger much longer than regrets from actions we'd rather not have taken. Itadori, despite all his suffering, would likely endure even greater anguish if he ignored everything, pretended he saw nothing, and chose to walk away. Our greatest regrets often stem from the lingering feeling that we could have done something differently. Studies show that regretting something we did is generally easier to cope with and less enduring than regretting something we never tried. Empathy plays a significant role in helping us connect with others, but it also has a downside for those who feel it deeply. If you're like Itadori, an empathetic person who easily experiences others' suffering, you understand how challenging it is to set boundaries on what you'll do for others, and how hard it is when those boundaries are crossed. Research reveals that regulating our emotions enhances our ability to connect positively with others. This skill, known as emotional regulation, is the capacity to absorb others' experiences without being overwhelmed. It's also essential for reducing stress. Itadori exemplifies this by effortlessly building relationships and being well-liked by almost everyone around him. His humility about his own abilities and his recognition of others' strengths make him approachable and non-competitive, even with characters like Megumi. The Shibuya arc profoundly impacts Itadori because it highlights his deep sensitivity to the unjust loss of life. Human suffering leaves a mark on him, something Nanami notices and acknowledges, recognizing how Itadori's empathy could become a source of pain, just as it once hurt Nanami. When Junpei, one of Itadori's recent friends, is tragically transformed, he feels a surge of hatred towards Mahito, a level of rage so intense that he contemplates killing, a thought he never entertained before. As the Shibuya arc unfolds, Itadori is forced to confront the unbearable weight of loss. Loved ones slip through his fingers, and he finds himself powerless to protect them. At one point, the stress overwhelms him, leaving him paralyzed. He admits he can't bear it anymore, worn down by so much death and fighting. This leads him to spiral further into self-blame, seeing himself as a failure. The emotions he had suppressed come rushing back all at once, and he feels as though forgiveness, both from himself and others, is unattainable. However, others around him pull him back from the brink. Their words help him realize that he was using his perceived failures as an excuse to avoid facing reality. Every person he fails to save deepens his guilt, a heavy burden that keeps him stuck. But guilt, as powerful as it is, serves a purpose. It drives change, a shift in behavior, a chance to reshape our lives. Yet guilt can also be unproductive, especially when tied to circumstances beyond our control. Itadori experiences this destructive form of guilt, one that eats away at him. Yet he ultimately finds meaning in his world through the stories he tells himself and the guidance he interprets from his grandfather's words. Hoffman's studies reveal that children with a healthy sense of guilt are more likely to exhibit prosocial behaviors and empathy. This healthy guilt is essential for forming connections with others, just as it helped Itadori grow. On the other hand, research by Jason Mosser shows that excessive guilt is linked to depression and anxiety, leading individuals to engage in self-punishing behaviors. Itadori punishes himself, not physically, but with his words and thoughts. Guilt's role is to inhibit negative behavior, teaching us lessons from actions we regret. It is a fundamental emotion, one that shapes us, challenges us, and ultimately helps us grow, if we let it. However, if you dwell too much on guilt even after learning from it, it becomes unproductive and serves only to cause more suffering. This is what happens with Itadori. Considering all the evidence in his world, suffering seemed inevitable for him, as he carried guilt to a level that made resolution impossible. He hadn't yet learned from Nami how to move forward after making a mistake. His guilt was deeply tied to the feeling that he must always prioritize others over himself. As Nanami once said, others come first. And this mindset often leads Itadori to neglect his own well-being in a completely self-destructive way. Itadori strives for something incredibly difficult, to be responsible for everything. Even Nanami points out that this is not only impossible, but also immature. That's why, when Itadori realizes he has to kill someone and that he likely won't be able to ensure a dignified death for everyone, Nanami tells him, "Today, you became a Jujutsu sorcerer." Being a Jujutsu sorcerer also meant becoming an adult and taking on painful responsibilities. Responsibility, as I've mentioned in my video about Nanami, involves sacrifice, giving up certain things in life to make room for others. We can't have everything, and most importantly, we can't save everyone. Itadori struggles to accept this harsh reality. He laments that life constantly reminds him that he is weak and useless. This happens because he ties his self-worth to what he can do for others. When he succeeds, he feels great, but when he doesn't, he spirals into despair, ruminating endlessly on his failures. According to Dr. Jared Brank from Avila University, there's nothing inherently wrong with revisiting the past and diving into what's known as episodic personal memory, recollections of past events in your life. The problem arises when these memories become counterfactual. Studies have shown that such mental reworking is linked to depression and potentially post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Itadori experiences this repeatedly, even over things beyond his control. He wants to control everything in a world that is inherently unstable. In terms of personality, counterfactual thinking correlates with high levels of neuroticism, a tendency toward excessive worry and anxiety, and low levels of agreeableness, which is associated with being less kind and gentle. It's easy to see how reliving past events and imagining different outcomes can make someone bitter, focusing on life's negatives instead of its positives. Despite his outward cheerfulness, Itadori often appears reserved and detached. He tries hard to project a pleasant, carefree demeanor, but inside, he's grappling with deep emotional struggles. This is the great trap of empathy, which Itadori embodies. Empathy isn't just about feelings. It also involves thoughts and requires balancing our perspective between ourselves and others. To truly put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we must find equilibrium between emotion and reason, between self and others. Without this balance, empathy becomes a trap, making us prisoners to others' emotions. Managing excessive empathy requires emotional intelligence and a high level of self-awareness. You must be prepared to meet your own needs. What Itadori lacked was the ability to direct some of the empathy he felt for others toward himself. Researcher Kristen Neff argued that having a kind attitude toward ourselves makes us more capable of reflecting on our mistakes and making real changes. Along with self-kindness, Neff identifies two other key elements of self-compassion: mindfulness, accepting our thoughts and feelings without becoming overwhelmed by them, and a sense of common humanity, recognizing that we are not alone or unique in our struggles. Satoru Gojo demonstrates this balance masterfully in the anime. Despite his immense power, he understands his limits and respects them. Even with all his abilities, he knows how far he can go. Like nearly everything in life, setting boundaries is crucial. For Itadori, his empathy, as admirable as it is, began to harm him. This would happen to anyone, especially when they take on responsibilities for things beyond their control. The situation worsens when we feel drained. The less energy we have, the less we can help others. Itadori eventually realized that the person who could help the most was Todo, someone who was at peace with himself. In other words, we need to care for ourselves first in order to care for others. Holding on to guilt for years, even after making amends, helps no one. It's simply impossible to be responsible for everything and everyone. But it's entirely possible and healthy to take responsibility for ourselves. Like, subscribe and share. This is just the beginning.